This is Duke University.
You published in 2007, Enlightenment in the Colony, the Jewish Question and the Crisis of Postcolonial Culture. I wanted to ask you a little bit to begin about your framing of this book, and in particular, the comparison that you do, which is a very revelatory, distant comparison.
Well, the project started for me really as a study of the partition of India and sort of trying to really think about how we could rethink this problem, which had become really pretty much settled in this idea of a kind of millennial conflict between Islam and Hinduism in South Asia. And more or less instinctively, I knew that that couldn't really be sustained, an argument like that, because what it means to be Muslim, what it means to be Hindu, something that has undergone massive transformations over the centuries and even more recently over decades. And that sort of gradually brought me to thinking about partition as an event and a process linked to what I call minoritization. That is to say, in the process of the emergence of nationalism in a society, how certain groups and certain cultural attributes that are associated with them come to be seen as minor practices, as minor social groupings and things of that sort. So I wanted to understand that process, how something and someone becomes a minority. And I felt that the partition of India was very much an event involved in this process, that Muslim separatism emerged out of Muslim minoritization. So that clearly, once I had reached that point of understanding, it directly led me to the history of the Jewish question in Western Europe in the 19th century, in the long 19th century, and to things like Karl Marx's essays on the Jewish question and other sort of 19th century writings on this issue. And so gradually it became clear that what I wanted to understand was how a problem, the problem of the minority, that first appeared in Europe in the form of the so-called Jewish question. What happens to that question when it transformed itself into a colonial question in a colonial society? So the way in which the Jewish question, as it were, travels to a place like India in the form of the Muslim question, that's how the project sort of came together.
So do you see then this issue of the problem of the minority as something that we can see replicated in other cases in the Middle East, South Asia, in the emergence of new states?
I think very much so. I mean, if you think about Christian minorities or Shia Muslim questions in the post First World War structure of states in the Middle East, I think they are very much part of this process. And in very remarkable and in some ways very tragic ways, of course, this has also played itself out in Israel-Palestine, where the question of what is a majority and what is a minority is a very fraught question. Right. And this idea that the day the Palestinian population becomes a majority will be the end of Israel as a Zionist and democratic state, this very common perception. So the question of the relationship between majorities and minorities is really defining for Middle Eastern politics, I think.
Interesting. So could you give us a little bit of a definition conceptually about how you used postcolonial secularism in this work?
So that was the other strand in that work. And once again, what I was interested in thinking about was how some things that are European in their origin, in this case now the question of the secular, and secularism as a kind of political program, how it would, in what ways does it get transformed in its kind of colonial and post-colonial reemergence? And in India, of course, the classic figure of post-colonial secularism is the figure of Jawaharlal Nehru, the first prime minister. So he became fairly central to my argument here in trying to understand how secularizing political projects deal with the question of minority. And what I sort of came to understand, and what I really wanted to understand, was the way in which secularist projects, which should supposedly not care about religious difference, in fact reproduce a certain kind of religious identity for both majoritarian and minoritarian populations. So that's what I was trying to think about when I coined that concept of postcolonial secularism.
And then just coming back to the overarching argument in the book. Is this where you then locate the crisis of post-colonial culture? Or how do you locate the crisis?
Yeah, I mean, the crisis of post-colonial culture, of course, is very broad term.
Yeah.
And in the South Asian context, we could link it to all kinds of issues, from gender to caste to language and region and, within the countries, regionalism within the country, all kinds of issues. But only one of them led to actually the catastrophe of partition. Only one of them led to a division of a society. Only one of them led to the uprooting of millions of people, the killing of hundreds of thousands probably, kidnapping and rape on a continental scale. I mean, this horrific event that lasted really several years. So only one of these fissures or contradictions in society led to this cataclysmic event. So I think has a kind of pride of place within the crisis. So that was my sort of focus, but by no means suggesting that there are not these other dimensions as well to the crisis of the post-colonial.